Runningonair video. In this one I'm going to take an overview of the SY35, looking at its synthesis functions in particular. The SY35 has a reputation of being difficult to program because of the limited amount of data entry features. But there's now another option, and that's a separate application for programming. Additionally, the application allows you to have a good idea of the architecture of the synth and what it's capable of. Before I get into that though, if you'd like to support the channel, then please check out some of my tracks on streaming and Bandcamp. I'll leave some links in the description. So let's get on with it. I'm just going to look at the SY35 physically to start. It's got a metal base and plastic top. The general impression you get is, I'd say, sort of budget. So in terms of connections, it's an external power supply, and then you've got phones, left-right audio outputs, a couple of controller inputs, and then the Midi in, out and through. There's also a card slot, and then the front panel itself. So we've got a pitch bend and modulation, so pretty standard there. Volume control, but you'll notice that there's no other sliders. So the only way to do any data change is using this plus and -1 or yes/no buttons. So that can make editing a bit cumbersome, to say the least. You've got the vector control over there, and then you've got the vector function, whether it's on/off, detune, which is quite a nice effect, or the level, which is essentially just a sort of cross-fading mixer. Then the cursor for getting around the screen. Then you've got the mode. Now voice is just a single mode, but there is a multi-mode, which I'm not really going to go into. It's covered well in the manual if you would find that sort of thing useful. Then you've got a button to get in and out of edit, and then a store button for storing patches. The display itself is reasonably clear, but it's one of these ones which, if you're directly above it, you can't see it so well. You kind of have to be sitting in front of it, then you get a better view. So this is the patch number, and over here it shows the patch number again, but you've got an I or P depending on whether it's a preset or an internal memory, and then the name, and then information about the mode and so forth. Over here you can switch between internal, card and preset. Then you have these buttons which you can select the patch with, or you can use the edit button over here to get into the programming functionality and setup and utilities and Midi and things like that. And then the last button is the demo button. What else? Yeah, it's not as good as my track. Definitely not. It's nowhere near as good as my track. The SY35 is a hybrid synth of FM synthesis and AWM synthesis. So AWM stands for Advanced Wave Memory, not a term you hear much these days. Essentially, it's a rompler, so you have a bank of samples which you can then manipulate with envelope shapers. The way this is implemented on the 35 is that you have 4 elements, 2 of which are AWM and 2 of which are FM. So perhaps the easiest way of understanding is to look at the programmer. So you can see on the programmer there are the 4 elements. The 2 at the top are the AWM and the 2 below are the FM. You can see there's a lot more features with the FM, which I guess is kind of what you would expect. I've got to say actually that the way in which this editor is set up, it's very nicely thought out. There's lots of little shortcuts that make things really straightforward. So for instance, if you double click on something, it resets to 0, which really speeds things up. You can use the wheel on the mouse just for fine control. And most of these things you can just, click on. So another nice feature of the editing is that if you right click on a control, you can get it to go to what you're touching. So if I right click there, it will go there. If I right click on there, it will go there. Right, now there's a couple of caveats which you need to be aware of if you're going to use this software. And initially you think, but then when you start using it in reality, it's not as bad as it sounds. There's a bit of a limitation in terms of the MIDI implementation. So if I change a setting on the voice editor, what you would want is for that information to be sent by MIDI system exclusive and for that parameter to change on the synth, and you could hear it instantly. And even better, you could perhaps automate it so that you could set up all kinds of sort of like morphing changes and stuff like that, and it would just do it. But it won't do that. That's not the way it works. Every time there's a change, the full patch information has to be sent over to the synth. Now that basically means that while that patch is being loaded into the synth will stop making any sound. So you can't really automate anything except via this vector control. Initially you think, well, that's a bit of a limitation, but it does it pretty quickly. So if you were perhaps adjusting a number of parameters, it's not such a big deal. I mean, the other thing that's worth saying is that if you're not getting the results you think you should, then you should reset some of the controls. I think sometimes the MIDI doesn't quite get through, or the synth doesn't respond at the right time. So the controls may have updated in the editor, but it's not updated on the synth. So just be aware of that sort of gotcha. So let's have a look at the voice editor. So I'll try and do this systematically. So we've got the MIDI settings. Here I've got it set up so that it's only talking to the synth itself. But there is space here for a controller device if that's of use. And then you've got routing between various things as well, which may be helpful in your setup. And we have this lock menu and a randomized voice. And the lock menu relates to locking certain parameters when you randomize the voice. Okay, so what's the randomized voice? So when you randomize the voice, then all of the parameters get randomized so that you can end up with some crazy sound, hopefully something useful, and then that could be the basis of a new patch. So let's see, so I've got this at the moment. So now I can then randomize that. So if I do this, so you can see everything changed here, and that information was sent. Anyway, that's gone now because I'm going to randomize again. Then we have this receive voice. It's basically where it's going to get its voices from. So I've got it set to synth, but then there's also these banks which are come from here. So if you had a bank file on your hard drive, then you could open it here, and then you can import them here and here. So yeah, that sort of makes sense, but that's in the browser section. Another thing you might want to do is you might want to load a sound from the synthesizer. So there's two ways to do that. One is to go up to this synth button here and then choose which patch you want. But I can also just press the get button here by loading from the keyboard itself, choose something. So let's say 43. And then it will go interrogate the synth. Now what's interesting at this point, if I go this route, then it automatically goes into edit mode, as you can see on the keyboard. So if you just wanted to load patches, that may not be the best way to go. Whereas if I go here, It's not going to let me do that because I'm not in voice mode. So if I go no, okay, and then press that. Now I can choose something. So I think probably the best way to do it is if you just wanted to peruse the patches without touching the actual keyboard itself, then you're better off going in this area. Because if you come here, you're going to go into edit mode. And that means that you're not going to be able to peruse the patches. So we've got this section here. This allows us to get a voice to edit. You can also send something back. Then we've got this config section. The synthesizer is 16 voice polyphonic, just like the DX7, but that's only the case when only 2 elements are active. So at the moment, with just 2 elements, that's 16 voice polyphonic. But if I want all 4 elements, and let's face it, most of the time you are going to want it, then it's only 8 voices. So the next section is this global aftertouch section. Now this, depending on the effect of this, will depend on what you set up below, but you've got quite a few options: amplitude modulation, pitch modulation, level, and the actual pitch itself, so you can use it as a pitch bend. Then we've got mod wheel, amplitude modulation, pitch modulation, again dependent on what you're setting up down here. Then there's the pitch bend control, and then a sort of global change to attack and release, and that will affect all of the envelopes if you just want to do a very quick and dirty change. You also have an envelope delay. While there is a global amount, you can opt envelopes in or out of that delay. The envelopes is slightly unusual, that, but better to have it than not. We have the next thing, which is the effects. So we've got a basic selection, various reverbs, delays, even a gated here, and there's a bit of distortion as well. Let's have a look at the elements then and see what options are available. But it's often very useful to work on each element separately, and that's not something that you can do through the editor. For that, you have to go back to the synth. So in order to isolate the elements, you need to go into edit mode on the synth itself, and there you can turn them on and off. Essentially, if you're in voice mode and you can see a voice up here, you can go to edit, tone, and then at the top here, you can see A, B, C, D. Now the one that is selected for internal editing on the synth will be the one which is surrounded by black. But then what you can do is you can then select the ones you actually want to hear. So even though that's the one that's being edited, I've turned it off, so I won't be able to hear it. I can now turn them on C and D, and now they're all off. So I've just got element A activated, which is one of the AWM elements. Essentially a rompler. Now you've got the waveforms in here. There's really quite a few. And it's not just a matter of emulating woodwind and strings and stuff like that. There's a lot of electronic sounds, some metallic sounds. There's all kinds of things here. The great thing is that a lot of those junk sounds, you think, well, I'm never going to use the saxophone sample. It's fine, that's just a very small part of it. There's lots of stuff. If you want purely electronic sounds, there are lots of options in here for that. So it is quite usable. Now there's no filter, but you still have a lot of choice. Then we've got, so I've got it on saw at the moment. And we've got this temperament control, and this will basically change the scaling on the keyboard so that it doesn't follow the standard tuning. So let's just try that out. So at the moment, sounds kind of normal. Let's go up here. Yeah, I don't know. That's kind of a bit nuts. Let's see what this one sounds like. Okay, so sitting on an octave, I'd have to give that some thought as to how useful that might be. Velocity sensitivity, so what have we got here? So we've got quite a few choices there. And then the aftertouch sensitivity, again, similar sort of thing. Detune, just for fine-tuning things. Then the actual pitch, which is going to be in semitones. So the pan isn't perhaps quite as flexible here as you might want because you've only got like 5 settings. So you can go there, you can go full extent, you can go into the middle, and you can do the same on the left-hand side. So then you've got a dedicated LFO. You can choose what it's going to go to, so amplitude modulation or pitch modulation, and you've got a choice of waveforms, so triangle, square, random sample and hold, ramp, sawtooth. Okay, so we've got the speed, and then we have the delay and the rate. Now, I think there might be a bug here. It works, but the graphic doesn't seem right to me. So I want the LFO to come in straight away with no delay whatsoever. So I've got the delay to 0, but you've got this rate which is like an attack envelope on the LFO itself. So if I put the rate up to full, that's what I want. But look at the shape on the diagram. The diagram actually looks like it's going to come in slowly. So I've got a feeling that that's sort of the wrong way around. If I set the rate to 0, it looks to me like it's going to come in instantly. I found that slightly misleading, but it does actually work. You just have to understand that the diagram sort of looks the opposite to what's going on. And if you didn't have the diagram, then the delay and the rate, I think, would make sense. I think that does make sense now. Wow, all of that just about the LFO. Okay, so now I'm going to go on to the envelope. So I don't think there's anything too unusual. So we have the delay function here. Again, there seems to be like the wrong way. So delay max, I would have thought that would be the maximum delay. But in actual fact, it's no delay whatsoever. Whereas so you've got to remember that this delay button is a global function, so you have to go back up here to change it. So we don't want that, but I just wanted to sort of demonstrate it. Now, one thing that's really useful here is because you've got a lot of controls here, and one of the things that I've always found a bit of a pain about envelope shapers, which are more sophisticated than ADSR, and that is that there's too many controls. You want to just do something quickly, and it's a bit more difficult to do that. So you've got these presets here, which is really quite useful. So you can just have something basic. You just want to do something quick and dirty, you just do that. You know, you strings, or do I need something that's a bit more like a piano? Or a guitar? Or a brass? It's just something quick. I know the kind of envelope I want, so that's a nice quick way to do it. But then you've got all these controls here as well. They work in exactly the same way. So if I double click, it goes to 0. If I right click, it goes to the position I want, and then I've got the wheel to adjust the way you want it to. So it's relatively straightforward. Then you've got scaling, both level and rate. So there's a couple of other things which are useful, and these will apply to the FM section as well. So if you right click on here, you can copy the envelope, and then you can paste the envelope onto the other elements. So if you just really want to do a pad where the envelopes are pretty much the same or very similar, or you just want to use that as your starting point, then that you can do that. And the other thing you can do is you can go up to the element name itself, you can copy the whole element, and then you can paste it over here. And then maybe the only thing you really want to do is detune this one a little bit. So if I put element C on, and that maybe I want that one saw 4. So wrapping up on the AWM. So obviously the lack of filters is a bit of a shame, but it's not like you're left without options. There are plenty of options for electronic sounds and cheesy acoustic copies as well. Yeah, the editor makes it so much easier that I'm just not going to bother with the synth interface in this case. It's going to be a lot more frustrating if I do that, even with the limitations of the Midi implementation. I'm going to start looking at the FM side of things. So I've got the element B, one of the FM elements, isolated. Now the FM side is a little more complex, but it shares a lot of the characteristics of the AWM side, so it's not too bad. The implementation on the synth itself for FM is probably one of the simplest that you can find. I think the reasoning behind the FM implementation of this is that they wanted to set something up that was easy, that people could understand, because FM has this reputation of being very difficult to program. How can you simplify it? Well, there's a number of ways you can do that. One is you don't have as many operators. So if you look at the FM implementation, there's only 2 operators, which you would think wouldn't really be enough to do anything at all. But there's a bit of a trick to this, and that is you've got a choice of waveforms. Initially, you would think, I'm going to get things like square wave and ramp and stuff like that, but they're not. They're actually unique. They're sort of chopped up and inverted sine waves. But the classic sine, if you just want to be a purist, but then you have all these others as well. On the carrier and the modulator, you've got a choice of 8 waveforms. That makes a big difference to what you can do. And then if you look at the structure of them, the algorithm themselves, well, you've got one which operator 2 is the modulator and goes into operator 1, but you can also change it so they're side by side, so there is no modulator. We also have a feedback control. Okay, so we've got the simplicity of the number of operators, and we have the choice of waveforms, which then gives you the option to get different sounds. By having the choice of waveforms, you're then making it more complicated again. So how do you make it really simple for the users? Well, you hide the waveforms, and what you do is you have a selection of presets, all of which, of course, will have different sounds. So by limiting the exposure to the complexity underneath the surface, then the idea is you have something that's a bit easier for people to use. But then, of course, you're missing out on quite a lot of programmability. What's interesting is that the editor was able to unlock that. So you don't find these waveforms on the synthesizer itself. You have to come here. So that's a really big reason to use the editor over using the synth. So running through the features then. So we've looked at the number of waveforms. We have the velocity sensitivity and the aftertouch sensitivity. So those the same as we've seen before. We have pitch in semitones, pan control. Obviously with 2 operators, then you can only really have 2 algorithms. So you've basically got them side by side, or you can have a modulator and a carrier. So the other thing we've got is the feedback control. You can't see where the feedback is on this one, so yeah, so you can hear it's making a difference, but I don't know whether the feedback is going from the output of operator 1 into the input of operator 2, or whether it's the output of operator 2 just going back into itself. I'm not sure, because both of those would have an effect. If we change the operator algorithm though to here, get rid of the feedback, as we'd expect, we can hear 2 sine waves. Okay, so if I then put the feedback up to the top, again, you can hear the sound has changed. So the feedback, in this case, must be going from the output of operator 2 back into itself. I've not been able to see anything in the documentation which clarifies that. So I don't know. I don't know if it really makes that much difference, but it'd just be good to know, wouldn't it? So if we go on to the LFO, so the LFO for the FM section works pretty much the same way as it does with the AWM, but the main difference is that you can choose whether to send the LFO to the modulator or the carrier or both. So essentially these buttons here. This is one of the things that was always really weak on the early FM synthesizers, that the LFO, you could do pitch modulation and you had a sort of global vibrato, and that was it. It was really bad in comparison, but this is actually significantly better. The fact that you've got the tremolo and the vibrato, and of course if you're just doing that to the modulator, then it's going to affect the actual tone as well. Well, it's those tonal changes which you would normally associate with a filter within analog. Okay, so let's have a look at the bottom section. So we've got the temperament section. I think this is probably where it's going to be more useful in the FM area compared to the AWM area. I've got the waveform, which we've already discussed, detune, which is sort of self-explanatory, and then we've got the harmonics. Probably easier to hear on the carrier. Okay, so half a harmonic, half a harmonic. So half the fundamental, fundamental, second harmonic, third harmonic, yes, that's right, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th. It's where the notes got really strange. 14th, 15th. Okay, everything up to 15 plus 0.5. Okay, so it's really the bedrock of FM programming there. So the next thing is the envelopes themselves. Well, they're pretty much the same as AWM. You have an overall level control. Now, what's a little interesting here is that you've still got the user type. So I can go for, let's go for string. Now, you'll notice, though, on the modulator side, you don't have that. But of course, what you can do is you can copy the envelope here and paste it there. So I'm not so sure why that's the case. I guess it's probably because maybe that function isn't there on the synth. So I think that covers the basic programming functionality. So overall, I think this is a great synth, and I think there's lots of opportunities to make some interesting sounds. The AWM side of things is limited, but you've got enough choices to include that along with the FM to create some interesting stuff. So I don't see that as a limitation, just more of a difference of approach, and obviously it's a little bit more constricted in terms of the sounds that you can use. On the FM side, the editor is a must, because it means that you can really get into the detail and really do some interesting stuff. So, is it worth getting one? Well, I think it's certainly worth having one to try out and see if you get on with it. I'm surprised how much I've enjoyed using this synth, and I intend to explore it a lot more. In fact, I'll probably do a video showing some of that, do something which is dedicated to just programming sounds. Now, the other thing that's good about it is it's an old synth, so if you wanted a vintage synth, and you want a vintage synth that's good, and you also want one that's cheap, these are good. You can pick these up for about £100 as long as you're willing to drive. If you're going to get someone to send it to you, it's going to cost you a bit more, and there's going to be more interest. I'm quite glad I got mine when I did, because it was cheap. I've got a feeling that, as with most synths, prices will be going up. So I'm going to do another video where I do a bit more programming, and so keep an eye out for that one. Again, thanks for watching. Hopefully catch you on the next one. Until then,